In 1957, a 19-year-old with no money walked into a trophy store in California and paid to have patches made for a motorcycle club he was starting from scratch. But what nobody predicted was that in just a few years, the organization he built from those patches would survive 2 federal convictions, 13 years in prison, and 5 decades of FBI and ATF pressure, and still be expanding. That boy was Ralph Sonny Barger, and the club he built was the Hells Angels. By the time he died in 2022, the Hells Angels had 6,000 members in 592 chapters across 66 countries. This is the story of Sonny Barger and how he turned the Hells Angels into an empire. The boy nobody wanted. Ralph Hubert Barger Jr. was born on October 8, 1938 in Modesto, California. His mother left when he was 4 months old. His father, Ralph Sr., was a day laborer on the Oakland docks who spent his evenings in waterfront bars and left the parenting to a strict Pentecostal grandmother. Between the two of them, they raised a boy who learned early that the world operated on 2 principles: strength and loyalty. He had seen what happened to people who had neither. In school, he was suspended multiple times for assaulting teachers and dropped out in the 10th grade. At 16, he forged his birth certificate and enlisted himself in the U.S. Army. He served 14 months before the forgery was discovered, and he was honorably discharged. He came home to Oakland with nothing except the knowledge of what it felt like to belong somewhere. That feeling would drive every decision he made for the next 66 years. He drifted after the discharge, lived with his father in a hotel room, worked as a warehouseman. In 1956, he joined his first motorcycle club and felt nothing there. No brotherhood. That absence was not a small thing. It was the whole point. The club disbanded. Barger started riding with a looser group of bikers that included a man named Don Boots Reeves, who wore a patch from a defunct Hells Angels chapter in North Sacramento. That patch was the first time Barger encountered the name. On April 1, 1957, he and a small group used that name to start their own chapter in Oakland. They were 19 years old. They had replica patches made at a trophy store in Hayward with no idea that other Hells Angels chapters already existed across California. They had no idea what they were walking into. The club that did not exist. Yet the Hells Angels that Barger founded in Oakland in 1957 was not the organization it would become. It was a small group of young men who shared a patch they had copied at a trophy store in a clubhouse in East Oakland that doubled as a gathering point for anyone willing to show up on a Friday night. The founding members were described by George Weathern, who became the chapter's vice president in 1960, as basically honest blue-collar or unskilled workers looking for excitement. Barger himself called his chapter a wild bunch. But here is what separated Barger from every other man in that room from the beginning. He was thinking beyond the room. After a chance encounter with a member of a pre-existing Hells Angels chapter in Southern California, Barger learned that the club had a history, rules, regulations, and procedures that the Oakland chapter knew nothing about. He traveled to Southern California. He met the other chapters. He studied how they operated and what they were doing wrong. And he came back to Oakland with a clear picture of what the Hells Angels could be if someone ran them the right way. In 1958, Otto Friedli, the president of the San Bernardino founding chapter, was imprisoned. Barger was 20 years old. He was proclaimed de facto national president. His first act was to relocate the mother chapter, the national headquarters, from San Bernardino to Oakland. Southern California was collapsing under police pressure. Chapters were shrinking. The Purdue founding chapter that had issued all new charters for nearly 15 years was losing members faster than it could replace them. Barger looked at that collapse and saw an opportunity. He began traveling, chapter by chapter across California, meeting presidents, building relationships, imposing a structure that the club had never had. Geographic limits so chapters did not step on each other. Mandatory meetings called church, a chain of command, a code of conduct. Rules that members were expected to follow, not because they were forced to, but because Barger made them understand that following the rules was what kept the whole thing alive. Hunter S. Thompson spent a year with the Angels in 1965 and 1966. and wrote the most detailed contemporary portrait of Barger that exists. In any gathering of Hell's Angels, Thompson wrote, "There is no doubt who is running the show. Ralph Sonny Barger, the maximum leader. A 6-foot, 170-pound warehouseman from East Oakland, the coolest head in the lot. A tough, quick-thinking dealer when any action starts. By turns, a fanatic, a philosopher, a brawler, a shrewd compromiser, and a final arbitrator. Barger's word goes unquestioned, although many of the others could take him in 2 minutes if it ever came to a fight. But it never does. He rarely raises his voice except in a rumble with outsiders. That last detail is the most important one. Barger commanded the most violent organization in America without being its most violent member. He did not need to be. When Thompson asked him directly what made him the leader, he gave an answer that had nothing to do with fighting. "I like to treat people the way I want to be treated. I like to tell the truth. I like to be on time, and I expect everybody else to be." By 1965, Oakland was on its way to becoming the capital of the Hells Angels world. Mounting police. Pressure in Southern California was pushing Angels north. Barger's chapter was swollen and absorbing everyone. The organization that had started with a handful of men and a copied patch was becoming something that no single city could contain. And Barger was already thinking about what came next. Taking the reins. By the mid-1960s, the Hells Angels had a problem that success had created. The name was spreading faster than Barger could control it. Clubs from as far away as Indiana, Pennsylvania, New York, Michigan, and even Quebec were applying for Hells Angels charters. When charters were not forthcoming, some clubs simply created their own insignia and started calling themselves Hells Angels anyway. A club called the Detroit Renegades did exactly this. They were eventually arrested when a police raid on their storefront clubhouse netted 18 pistols. Barger's response to the expansion pressure was characteristically precise. He would not let just anyone wear the patch. The Angels. Only hope for controlling their image, he understood, was selective expansion. Charter only the biggest and meanest clubs who apply, but only on the condition that they terrorize anyone else in their area who tries to use the name. The patch was not a symbol to be handed out. It was a product, and products had to be protected. In 1966, Barger formalized what he had been building. He incorporated the Hells Angels as the Hells Angels Motorcycle Corporation in the United States and Canada. The Death Head logo was trademarked. The name was legally protected. The organization that had started with replica patches from a trophy store in Hayward now had lawyers and a corporate registration and the legal standing to protect its intellectual property in court. Barger had built a franchise before the word existed in the criminal world. The rules he imposed during this period defined the club's identity for the next 6 decades. The male-only rule came in 1964. His justification was practical, rather than ideological. Female members, he argued, were less able to defend themselves against rival bikers who might try to steal their patches. The Harley-Davidson only rule followed. The bottom rocker system identifying which territory each chapter controlled was established and enforced. Every chapter paid mandatory dues. Every member understood what the patch required of them and what the club required in return. But building the brand also meant managing the press. And Barger understood the press in a way that most organization leaders never did. Barger understood that the media was not an enemy to be avoided. It was a tool to be managed. Every story about the Hells Angels that appeared in a national publication made the patch more valuable, made membership more desirable, made the organization harder to dismantle because it had become something larger than any single chapter or any single criminal enterprise. Chapter presidents have no set term in office, Thompson wrote. A strong one like Barger will remain unchallenged until he goes to jail, gets killed, or finds his own reasons for hanging up the colors. Dissenters in the ranks are handled quietly at the regular Friday night meetings, or they simply fade out of the picture. What Barger had built by the mid-1960s was not just a motorcycle club. It was an institution, with a corporate structure, a trademarked brand, a national franchise system, and a media strategy. The counterculture collision. In 1965, America was tearing itself apart over Vietnam. The anti-war movement was building toward confrontations that would define the decade. And in the middle of all of it, the Hells Angels occupied a position that nobody had anticipated, and nobody quite knew what to do with. They were not hippies. They were not political. They were rigidly anti-communist and instinctively patriotic, in the way that working-class men who had grown up in the shadow of World War II tended to be. Thompson described their political views as the same kind of retrograde patriotism that motivated the John Birch Society. They were blind to the irony of their role, knight-errants of a faith from which they had already been excommunicated. In October 1965, 6 Hells Angels attacked anti-Vietnam War demonstrators in Berkeley. A police sergeant suffered a broken leg. The Angels considered the protesters unpatriotic. Barger sat in his living room and listened to the Vietnam Day Committee's arguments and brushed them all aside. He considered them all chicken shit. And that was that. But then Barger did something that captured perfectly the contradictory nature of what he had become. He sent a telegram to President Lyndon Johnson at the White House. On behalf of himself and his associates, he volunteered a group of loyal Americans for behind-the-line duty in Vietnam. He wrote that a crack group of trained guerrillas would demoralize the Viet Cong and advance the cause of freedom. He signed it Ralph Barger, Jr., Oakland, California President of Hells Angels. Johnson never responded personally. Barger read the telegram aloud at a press conference with 42 reporters present and 13 microphones. The Angels did not go to Vietnam, but the telegram went everywhere. The counterculture did not give up on the Angels easily. Allen Ginsberg, Ken Kesey, Neil Cassidy, and Kesey's Merry Pranksters came to Barger's house in Oakland the Wednesday before the November 1965 protest march. Political discussion was resolved by phonograph voices of Joan Baez and Bob Dylan. The whole group chanted the Buddhist highest perfect wisdom sermon, together. The Angels had never met anyone quite like Ginsberg. They considered him otherworldly. Terry the Tramp described the encounter afterward. That goddamn Ginsberg is gonna f us all up. For a guy that ain't straight at all, he's about the straightest son of a I've ever seen. You should have been there when he told Sonny he loved him. Sonny didn't know what the hell to say. Despite everything Ginsberg said, Barger told Thompson a week before the November march that he was going to meet it with the biggest bunch of outlaw bikes anybody ever saw in California. But then the Angels called a press conference the day before and announced they would not attack the marchers. Their mimeographed statement said any physical encounter would only produce sympathy for this mob of traitors. And then came Hunter S. Thompson. His book Hells Angels, published in 1967, made Barger globally famous. It introduced the Maximum Leader to a worldwide audience and turned the Oakland chapter into something that transcended its criminal reality and became a cultural phenomenon. Thompson eventually paid for his access. The Angels beat him toward the end of his year with them, and his long-standing rapport with the club ended in that confrontation. But by then, the book was already written, and Barger understood better than Thompson did what that book was worth. The counterculture wanted to claim the Angels as kindred spirits, rebels against the system, fellow travelers on the road away from mainstream America. Barger let them think what they wanted. He took the LSD with Ginsberg and Kesey. He read the telegram to Johnson on national television. He gave Thompson his year, and when the book came out and made him famous, he understood that fame was protection, that an organization everybody had heard of was harder to dismantle than one operating in the shadows. He had started building the brand in 1966 when he incorporated the club. The counterculture collision of 1965 and 1966 had given that brand something no corporate strategy could buy: a mythology. The summer of love and the birth of the criminal empire. In 1967, San Francisco was the center of the world. The summer of the love had drawn hundreds of thousands of young people to the Bay Area. They came for the music, the drugs, and the promise of a new way of living. The Hells Angels were already there, and they were watching what was happening with the cold commercial instinct of men who understood that where there was demand, there was money. The Angels began selling PCP that summer. The drug became known in San Francisco as Dust of the Angels. Barger later admitted that beyond the PCP, his chapter moved most of the LSD in the San Francisco area during that period. According to FBI agent Tim McKinley, who spent years investigating Hells Angels-related cases, it was 1967 that the Hells Angels became a major criminal organization in their own right. Prior to that year, they had been subcontractors. Other criminal organizations used them to distribute cocaine and marijuana. They took a cut and did what they were told. But in 1967, that changed. The Angels were no longer working for someone else. They were running their own operation, and the money that came from controlling the PCP and LSD markets in San Francisco made the club wealthy for the first time in its history. Wealth changed everything. The organization that had started as a brotherhood for men who felt no brotherhood anywhere else was now a criminal enterprise with revenue and territory, and the need to defend both. But here is what made the Hells Angels different from every other criminal organization that the FBI was watching in 1967. They did not hide what they were. They rode in formation down public highways wearing their colors. They held press conferences. They had a trademarked logo and a corporate registration. They were the most visible criminal organization in America, and that visibility was by design. Barger had understood from the beginning that an organization nobody could ignore was an organization that had a different kind of power than one operating in the shadows. The personal cost of the drug empire landed on Barger himself as directly as it landed on anyone. In his autobiography, he wrote that he snorted so much coke he did not know what he was doing from one moment to the next. He added that his cocaine mood swings got him into a lot of deep trouble and would ultimately land him in Folsom Prison. He admitted when later charged with racketeering that he used and sold drugs, including heroin, but he noted these were his personal affairs and did not represent the rest of the Hells Angels. That distinction between personal conduct and organizational policy was one Barger maintained consistently throughout his life. He was not the Hells Angels. The Hells Angels were not him. The organization was bigger than any single member, including its founder. That belief was either the most sophisticated piece of legal strategy in criminal history or a genuine philosophical conviction, possibly both. In 1972, Servio Winston Aguero, 29 years old, was shot dead and his house set on fire after selling the group bad drugs. Barger and 3 other Hells Angels members were charged with the killing. All 4 were acquitted in 1972. No drug burns was one of Barger's own rules. The killing of Aguero was that rule being enforced at its most extreme, and the acquittal was the legal system's first significant failure to hold Barger accountable for what the organization he had built was doing. It would not be the last. Altamont. By 1969, the Hells Angels were the most famous outlaw motorcycle club in the world. Thompson's book had been out for 2 years. The counterculture had spent 4 years trying to claim them as kindred spirits. And on December 6, 1969, the Rolling Stones handed Barger and his organization a moment that would define them in the public imagination for the next 50 years. The Rolling Stones were finishing their 1969 American tour. Their manager, Sam Cutler, contacted the Hells Angels to provide security at a free concert at Altamont Speedway in Livermore, California. The payment agreed upon was $500 worth of beer. Barger later said the Angels were used as dupes, that the Stones got a security force for the price of a bar tab, and then blamed the Angels when everything went wrong. What went wrong in front of cameras. During the Rolling Stones performance, Meredith Hunter, an 18-year-old black man, pushed toward the stage. A Hells Angels member confronted him. Hunter pulled a gun. The Angels stabbed him. Hunter was stabbed multiple times and died on the ground in front of the stage while the Rolling Stones continued playing. The killing was captured on film by the documentary crew that had been hired to record the concert. That footage appeared in the 1970 documentary Gimme Shelter and was seen around the world. When the Rolling Stones considered canceling the rest of their show, Barger reportedly pulled a gun on the group. He later denied the specific detail, but never denied the broader reality of what had happened at Altamont or the Angels' role in it. His public response afterward was characteristically defiant. He accused Mick Jagger directly of using the Angels as dupes. He claimed the trouble had started when the crowd began mishandling the club's motorcycles. He never apologized. Not to the Stones, not to the public, not to the family of Meredith Hunter. The Hells Angels member who stabbed Hunter was acquitted on grounds of self-defense. Altamont did something to the Hells Angels' public image that no law enforcement operation had managed to do. It made them genuinely frightening to people who had previously found them colorful or romantic. The counterculture that had spent 4 years trying to claim the Angels as fellow travelers now recoiled from what they had seen on screen. The Summer of Love was 3 years in the past. Altamont buried it, but Barger understood something about the Altamont fallout that his critics did not. Fear was not the same as destruction. The Angels were more famous after Altamont than they had been before it. The patch was more recognizable. The name was more powerful. What the world had watched at Altamont was not the end of the Hells Angels. It was proof of what they were capable of. And in the world Barger operated in, that proof was worth more than any amount of good press. But the government had watched Altamont too, and what they saw convinced them that the approach of harassing individual members for individual crimes was not going to be enough. They needed a different strategy, one that could take down the entire organization at once. The legislative and law enforcement response to Altamont did not materialize overnight, but the cultural response was immediate. The press that had spent years treating the Angels as colorful outlaws now treated them as a genuine threat. The politicians who had tolerated them as a fringe phenomenon now had footage of a man being to death at a concert to point to. And Barger understood that the organization he had built needed a different relationship with the public than the one Altamont had produced. His solution was not to retreat. It was to add a layer. He began a deliberate campaign to soften the public image of the Hells Angels. Charity runs, toy drives for children at Christmas, appearances at community events, selective cooperation with law enforcement when the price was right. The contradiction between what the Angels were doing in their criminal operations and what they were presenting to the public was not accidental. It was strategic. Barger understood that an organization universally feared could not operate as effectively as one that was feared selectively. Public goodwill was a form of protection. A club that donated toys to sick children was harder to legislate out of existence than one that had nothing to show the public except Altamont. The charity work existed alongside the trafficking and the violence because Barger wanted it to. The two faces of the organization were not in conflict. They were complementary. One generated revenue, the other generated protection, but the image management had limits. In 1973, Barger was convicted of heroin trafficking. He was sentenced to prison and served time at Folsom State Prison. He was released in 1977. But here is what the heroin conviction did not do. It did not remove him from power. The club continued operating while he was at Folsom. The structure he had built was robust enough to function without him present. He married his second wife Sharon Grulka during his incarceration. He was running the organization from inside a prison cell in a way that most criminal leaders could only manage with an army of intermediaries. When he was released in 1977, he walked back into the same position he had left. Nothing had changed except that the government had learned something important. Sending Sonny Barger to prison did not stop the Hells Angels. Therefore, in 1979, the U.S. government tried a different approach. They charged Barger with violating the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. RICO had been designed specifically to prosecute entire criminal organizations rather than pursuing individual members for individual crimes. The theory was that the Hells Angels were not a motorcycle club that happened to have criminal members. They were a criminal enterprise that used the motorcycle club as cover. If prosecutors could prove that Barger ran the organization as a criminal enterprise, he could be convicted not just for his own crimes, but for the crimes of every member acting on behalf of the club. In 1980, Barger was acquitted of the racketeering charges. The RICO approach had not worked, but the government did not stop trying, and Barger understood that the next attempt would be larger and more coordinated than anything that had come before it. The club established a mandatory legal defense fund from member dues. Every angel contributed. Every chapter maintained a war chest for the legal battles that everyone knew were coming. What Barger had built was resilient enough to survive a founder's imprisonment. It was about to be tested on whether it was resilient enough to survive a coordinated federal assault on its entire national structure simultaneously. Prison and the RICO Wars. The 2 years between 1979 and 1981 were the most legally dangerous period the Hells Angels had faced since Barger unified the California chapters in the late 1950s. The RICO acquittal in 1980 had stopped one federal assault, but the government had learned from the failure and was already building the next case. What made the RICO strategy so threatening to the Angels was not the specific charges it produced. It was the theory behind it. If prosecutors could establish that the Hells Angels Motorcycle Corporation was a criminal enterprise, then every member who had ever acted on behalf of the club was potentially liable for the crimes of every other member. The patch itself would become evidence of criminal conspiracy. Wearing it would be participation in an ongoing criminal enterprise. The legal structure Barger had built in 1966 to protect the brand would become the prosecution's primary exhibit. Barger fought back through lawyers. The club's mandatory legal defense fund meant that every federal charge produced a coordinated legal response rather than individual members scrambling to find representation. The organization that Barger had built operated like a corporation in its criminal enterprises and like a corporation in its legal defense. The same structure that made it dangerous made it defensible. But while the legal battles were being fought in courtrooms, the criminal operations were expanding globally. Canada had been penetrated in 1977 through the patching over of the Popeyes Motorcycle Club in Montreal. Australia had Hells Angels chapters since the late 1960s. Europe was being colonized through the 1970s and 1980s chapter by chapter using the same selective expansion strategy Barger had developed in California. By the early 1980s, the patch that had been copied at a trophy store in Hayward in 1957 was being worn in over 30 countries. The global expansion created a logistical network that law enforcement struggled to map, let alone disrupt. The Melbourne chapter of the Hells Angels demonstrated exactly how that network operated. Over a 2-year period starting in 1980, the Melbourne chapter shipped 300 liters of P2P, a chemical precursor necessary to manufacture amphetamine, to the United States. 2 cans per shipment, each shipment providing enough P2P to produce $50 million worth of amphetamine. The Melbourne chapter received no share of the profits. They were told this was their contribution to helping Barger and the other Hells Angels leaders pay the legal fees from the RICO case. That detail captures something essential about what the organization had become under Barger's leadership. An overseas chapter was shipping industrial quantities of drug precursor, chemicals across the Pacific Ocean to fund the legal defense of the American leadership. The club was not a collection of individual criminal operations loosely affiliated under a shared patch. It was a vertically integrated multinational criminal organization with a legal defense arm funded by contributions from chapters on multiple continents. Wikipedia's assessment is direct. The Hells Angels developed into a sophisticated and structured criminal organization largely as a result of Barger's leadership. He oversaw the club's expansion across the United States by establishing chapters in new territories, often by patching over existing biker gangs in pursuit of controlling the drug trade nationwide. The RICO acquittal had bought time. The Melbourne shipments were keeping the lawyers paid. But the federal government was not finished. And in November 1987, they came back with an operation that was larger, more coordinated, and more precisely targeted than anything they had attempted before. On November 10, 1987, the FBI, the ATF, and the California State Police moved simultaneously. Raids hit Hells Angels chapters across the Bay Area at the same moment. 13 Angels were arrested, including Barger. Over 100 weapons were seized. More than $1 million in cash and drugs. 3 methamphetamine laboratories. The raids were the conclusion of a 2-year undercover investigation that had embedded federal agents inside the organization's operations and documented what the government was now prepared to argue in open court. Barger and 9 other Angels were extradited to Kentucky. The trial opened in Louisville Federal Court in July 1988. The charges were conspiracy to transport firearms and explosives across state lines. Specifically, the government argued that Barger and the other defendants had plotted to bomb Outlaws MC clubhouses in the Portland neighborhood of Louisville in retaliation for the killing of a Hells Angels member named John Cleve Webb. The prosecution asserted that the Hells Angels were a highly organized criminal organization ruled by a code of silence involved in drug trafficking shootings and bombings. Former Hells Angels member George Christie described the conversation that preceded the bombing plot in terms that left little room for ambiguity. Tony said there is going to be collateral damage. Sonny said, "I know, but it is worth it." 100 Hells Angels wearing full colors attended the trial. Country singer Johnny Paycheck, a personal friend of Barger, also attended. The U.S. Marshals Service provided security, and the assistant prosecutors assigned to the case were deputized by the marshals, allowing them to carry guns inside the courthouse. The government had decided that prosecuting Sonny Barger required the same security arrangements as prosecuting a head of state. The 12-week trial ended in conviction. Barger was sentenced to prison. He served 4 years at a federal facility in Phoenix, Arizona, and was released in 1992. His response to the verdict delivered to the Associated Press became one of the most quoted lines of his life. "I think it was a devastating blow to the government, and I could not be happier with the verdict, except if I had been found innocent myself." That line was not bravado for the cameras. It was a precise legal observation. Barger had been convicted on the conspiracy charge. But the government had spent 2 years and millions of dollars building a case that was supposed to finally dismantle the organization he had built. The conviction of one man on one charge was not that. The organization was still standing. The chapters were still operating. The patch was still being worn in 30 countries. The government had sent Sonny Barger to prison again. And again, it had not stopped the Hells Angels. But 4 years in a federal facility in Arizona, while his organization continued to operate without him, was not nothing. When Barger was released in 1992, he was 53 years old. He had spent 13 years of his life in prison across multiple sentences. He had survived a heroin trafficking conviction, a RICO acquittal, and a conspiracy conviction. He had been acquitted of murder. He had watched the federal government dedicate 2 full years of undercover investigation to building a case against him and emerge with less than they had hoped for. And something else had happened while he was serving those 4 years. Something that had nothing to do with law enforcement or rival clubs or federal prosecutors. Something that was happening inside his own body that no amount of legal strategy could fight. In 1982, Sonny Barger was diagnosed with throat cancer. He had smoked 3 packs of Camel cigarettes every day for 30 years. The doctors removed his vocal cords. They made a hole in his throat to allow him to speak. He lost his voice entirely for a period and had to learn to communicate again through the opening they had cut. When his voice came back, it was not the voice he had before. It was a raspy near whisper that sounded like gravel moving through a narrow pipe. Rough and low and unmistakable. That voice became as recognizable as the death head patch. He temporarily handed operational control to his second-in-command, Michael O'Farrell, during treatment. But he came back. He always came back. The man who had survived a fractured skull during a fight with Oakland police in 1958, and an attempted murder charge in 1965, and a heroin trafficking conviction in 1973, and a RICO prosecution in 1979, and a federal conspiracy conviction in 1988, was not going to be stopped by something growing in his throat. He went through the treatment. He adapted to the new voice, and he returned to running the organization as if the interruption had been a minor inconvenience. The throat cancer was not the last time his body turned against him. In 2010, he was diagnosed with prostate cancer. His prostate was removed. He was subsequently declared free of cancer. He was 71 years old and had now survived 2 separate cancers and 13 years in prison and more legal battles than most criminal lawyers see in an entire career. What his wife Zorana observed about him in his final years captured something that the criminal record and the conspiracy convictions and the FBI surveillance files could not. When she described what drove him, she could not fully explain it. He got back from trips and she wanted to lie on the ground and sleep, and he was running around checking on the horses and getting things done. He woke up and went all day. He loved to get things done. When he said he was leaving at 6, he meant 6. He was always on time and he did not tolerate lateness in anyone around him. The maximum leader of the most powerful outlaw motorcycle organization in the world was packaging his own book orders and taking them to the post office himself. He and Zorana ran the internet business together. She checked the emails and printed the orders. He packaged them and drove them to the post office. He signed every book personally, regardless of how long the line was at a signing. His fourth wife said he would sign the last book even if everyone around him was urging him to take a break. "No, I am fine. Just sign away." He was asked once what the best thing that ever happened to him was. He said, "I woke up this morning." That answer was not a performance. It was the philosophy of a man who had been given reasons to not wake up on more mornings than most people could count. The army had discharged him, the courts had convicted him, the FBI had raided him, the cancer had taken his voice, and every single morning he got up and went all day and expected everyone around him to do the same, but the body that had survived everything was running out of time. In his final years, Barger knew it. The liver cancer that would kill him was already progressing. He had stepped down from leadership in 1998. He had moved to Arizona. He had built a quiet life around horses and motorcycles and his wife and the mail orders from the website. The empire was still running. The chapters were still operating. The patch was still being worn in 66 countries. He had done what he set out to do. The personal cost. The public record of Sonny Barger's life is a legal document. Marijuana possession, 1963. Marijuana possession again, 1964. Assault with a deadly weapon, 1965 and 1966. Attempted murder charge that ended in a hung jury and was reduced to assault with a deadly weapon with 6 months served. Heroin trafficking conviction, 1973. RICO acquittal, 1980. Federal conspiracy conviction, 1988. 59 months in federal prison in Phoenix. Released 1992. Aggravated assault conviction, 2003. 8 days served. 13 years total inside various correctional facilities across a career that began when he was a teenager and ended only when his body gave out. But the personal cost of what Barger built was not measured only in years served. It was measured in the people closest to him and what happened to them. His first wife was Elsie Mae George. Thompson mentions her handling communications at their Oakland home during the turbulent period of 1965 and 1966. She was a real presence in Barger's life during the years when he was building the organization into something the world had never seen. Elsie died in 1967. She was 29 years old. She died from an embolism following a self-induced abortion. Barger was 28. He had spent the previous decade building an empire, and the woman who had been beside him during the most formative years of that construction was gone before the decade ended. He married his second wife, Sharon Grulka, while serving time at Folsom State Prison following his 1973 heroin trafficking conviction. They were together for over 2 decades. They split in 1996. 3 years later, he married Beth Noel Black. That marriage ended in 2003 following a domestic dispute that resulted in Black being hospitalized. Barger was convicted of aggravated assault. He served 8 days in jail. His fourth wife was Zorana. He married her on June 25, 2005. She described him as brutally honest in a way that some people found difficult. If you thought you wanted to hear that you looked good in an outfit when you probably did not, you did not ask Sonny. Because he was going to tell you what he really saw, not what you wanted to hear. She described him as kind, as a man with the biggest heart, as someone who stopped on his bike for transients on the side of the road and pulled money from his pocket to give them, as long as they were not smoking. Because he knew what smoking had cost him and he was not going to support anyone else's cigarette habit. She said when she thought about what made him the man he was, it was simple. He treated people the way he wanted to be treated. He told the truth. He was on time and he expected everyone else to be. Those were his own words about his own leadership philosophy. The same words he had given in the interview, the same philosophy that had kept him unchallenged at the head of the most powerful outlaw motorcycle club in the world for 4 decades. Barger had no biological children. His sister, Shirley Rogers, confirmed this publicly after his death. The man who had spent his life building a family of thousands had none of his own. The brotherhood he had felt no trace of in his first motorcycle club in 1956 had grown into an organization of 6,000 patched members across 66 countries. But there was no son or daughter who carried his name forward. Only the patch, only the death head, only the organization that outlived him and continued operating after he was gone exactly as he had designed it to do. The 1965 bar incident captured in his own autobiography tells you something about the man that the legal record alone cannot. He forced his pistol into a bar patron's mouth after the man made disparaging remarks about the Hells Angels. He claims the gun fired by accident, but he wrote in the autobiography that since the man was already shot in the head, he bent him over the pool table and shot him again. He was charged with attempted murder. The jury hung. The charge was reduced. He served 6 months. He never expressed regret about any of it. He told the Associated Press after his conspiracy conviction that it was a devastating blow to the government and he could not be happier with the verdict, except if he had been found innocent himself. He was going to prison, and he was framing it as a partial victory. That was not bravado. That was the genuine philosophy of a man who had decided very early that the world was going to have to work a lot harder than that to break him. It never did. In 2000, Barger published his autobiography. He called it Hell's Angel, The Life and Times of Sonny Barger and the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. He wrote it with Keith and Kent Zimmerman, and it became a bestseller. He toured the United Kingdom to promote it. The Home Office considered denying him entry on the grounds of his criminal record before allowing him in. The Daily Telegraph called him a legend. The Times described him as affable, big-hearted, warm. The man who had been raided by the FBI and convicted of conspiracy and served 13 years in prison was being reviewed in the British press like a visiting dignitary. He understood what the book was. It was the final layer of the brand he had been building since 1966. The incorporation had made the organization legal. The trademark had protected the name. The charity runs had softened the public image. And now the autobiography put Barger's own version of the story on record permanently. Not the FBI's version, not the ATF's version, not the version that appeared in court documents and criminal indictments. His version, the one where he was not a criminal organization leader, but a man who had built a brotherhood out of nothing and defended it against everything the government could throw at it for 40 years. From 2010 to 2012, he appeared in several episodes of Sons of Anarchy, playing elder biker Lenny the Pimp Janowitz. The show was the most watched drama on cable television at its peak. Barger appeared in it as himself in everything but name, an elder statesman of a world that the show's writers had, built largely around the mythology he had created. Millions of people who had never heard of the Oakland chapter or the Louisville trial or the Melbourne P2P shipments watched Sons of Anarchy and encountered something that had originated in Barger's life and decisions and philosophy. He continued writing every day in Arizona. He continued packaging his own book orders and taking them to the post office. He continued signing every autograph at every signing, no matter how long it took. The empire was still running. The chapters were still operating. And the man who had built all of it was living quietly with his wife and his horses in the Arizona desert, doing his own mail runs. On June 29, 2022, Sonny Barger died of liver cancer in Livermore, California. He was 83 years old. His final message was posted to his Facebook page after his death. Keep your head up high, stay loyal, remain free, and always value honor. More than 7,000 people attended his funeral. At the time of his death, the Hells Angels had over 6,000 members in 592 chapters across 66 countries, the largest outlaw motorcycle club in the world. 57 years after a 19-year-old boy from Oakland had replica patches made at a trophy store in Hayward and founded a chapter of a club he had never heard of. Hunter S. Thompson called him the maximum leader in 1965. Thompson spent a year inside the organization and emerged with a book that made Barger globally famous and a beating that ended his access. He understood Barger better than almost any outside observer ever did. And the maximum leader he described in 1965 was the same man who packaged his own mail orders in Arizona in 2022. The same man who stopped for transients on the side of the road. The same man who told the truth even when people did not want to hear it. The same man who was always on time and expected everyone else to be. The boy nobody wanted had built something nobody could take away. Sonny Barger built the largest outlaw motorcycle organization in history, from a copied patch and a trophy store in Hayward. The FBI spent 5 decades trying to destroy it and never managed it. In Australia, a club survived similar raids legislation wars with their own former members and a government that declared them a criminal organization. Click the next video to see how that unfolds.